the Center for Teaching and Learning at Lewis and Clark State College, also 2021 to 2023, M.C. Lang Fellow at the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. Dr. Christine Doyle is Professor of English Emeritus at Central Connecticut State University and author, among other things, of Louisa May Alcott and Charlotte Bronte, Transatlantic Translations. And then our third panelist, Dr. Gregory Eiselein, is Donnelly Professor of English and University Distinguished Teaching Scholar at Kansas State University. Very long list of publications, among others, Literature and Humanitarian Reform in the Civil War Era. Now, the prompt is, what makes Little Women a great American novel? Little Women reinforces the ideas of individuality and female vocation frequently throughout. What role do these ideas play in the book? Who influenced Alcott's writings and who did her writings influence? How did you describe her place in American literature? And if I'd been in charge of the prompt, I would say, and is she just the most wonderful and delightful writer ever in American literature? And is this part of her claim to fame? Which I want everybody to say yes to. 3 14-minute talks, alphabetical order, then the Q&A. Q&A is either the moderators looking directly at the chat or Q&A buttons where you put in your questions, or I do them, or I just provide questions of my own. I provide questions in any particular order that's fun for a conversation, not chronological. Any question that doesn't get answered, please send to me afterwards, randall@nas.org. I'll be delighted to forward them to the panelists so they can have the option to reply to you. So don't worry about your question not getting answered. And this is being recorded for posterity and permanence on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Should be up within 24 hours. And if you have to leave partway through, that means you get a chance to look at it again in a few hours. Having said all that, Professor Daly-Galeano, may I ask you to speak first?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have to say, I'm so happy to be here today, especially alongside Chris and Greg. Their work has been so important in Alcott studies and has shaped my own. So it's really an honor to get to share this time with them. I thought I'd begin with a little story that helps to illustrate Alcott's place within this topic of the great American novel. And I'm going to draw that from the Camp Lawrence chapter of Little Women. You may recall, if you are a lover of the novel, that in that chapter, the March sisters join their neighbor, Lori Lawrence, for a picnic with some out-of-town guests. At this picnic, the participants participate in games, and one of the games that they mention is a game called Authors. Now, I'm not quite sure in the novel what this game is that Alcott's referring to, but I do know that in 1861, Whipple and Smith made a card game called Authors, and in this card game, Louisa May Alcott was one of the cards. Now, when you hear the list of the other authors, I think you will be rather impressed, because we've got Alcott, and then there was Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, William Thackeray, Robert Louis Stevenson, James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Longfellow, Sir Walter Scott, Sir Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Edgar Allan Poe. So Alcott was the 13th card among this group of 12 men. There were no other women included in this deck. You'll notice there was no card for Jane Austen, George Eliot, Emily Dickinson, or Harriet Beecher Stowe. And what I think this helps us to understand, this was the 1893 edition of Authors that came out, in which Alcott was a card. And so this is about a quarter of a century after the publication of Little Women. Within those 25 years, she had earned a place alongside Shakespeare and Scott, among others. So very much I want to begin the conversation in thinking about her as part of a community of great authors. And we are talking today about the ways that Little Women is situated within a group of great novels. And I think Alcott sometimes gets overlooked in conversations of great novels and Little Women as well. So I'm really happy that we have this opportunity to focus on this text. Chris and Greg, I know, will be discussing the novel itself in greater detail. What I'll be talking about today are the works and people that influenced Alcott, and then the way that her work and Little Women have influenced later works and writers. So to begin this query, I went to the journals and looked in Alcott's journals in the years leading up to the publication of Little Women in 1868. And I just wanted to see what she was reading, because she often writes about the books that she was reading and rereading in her journals. So she repeatedly mentions Goethe, Dickens, Hawthorne, Fanny Burney, and Walter Scott, among many others. She was an active reader. She read books, she read them over and over again, and took great pleasure from her reading life. Alcott loved Goethe, and I think traces of that are apparent in Little Women. But of course, Dickens is the author who's kind of all over the place in the novel. And, I think most obviously in the March Sisters recreated Pickwick Club, in which they made their own Pickwick portfolio. But also think about the characters in this novel. The mean schoolmaster, Mr. Davis, could come straight from Hard Times, or the foibles of Daisy and Demi, I think, have a very Dickensian quality as well. Now, Alcott's appreciation for Frances Burney makes sense to me because she loved Evelina, and in Evelina's epistolary, she gives voice to all of her characters, but gives a unique voice, especially to her female protagonist. This, to me, is exactly what makes Little Women such an amazing novel, is that it gives women's voices and women's stories the prime position in a way that felt still very new and fresh to readers in the late 1860s. Another thing I wanted to mention was to give you a sense of what Alcott's readers in the time would have been looking at. And of course, the answer to that is everything, right? This is the 19th century. Printing is cheap, literacy is high. People were reading the classics, but I think that one area that gets overlooked in literary studies of this period is the reading of periodicals. So in the 19th century, this is coming off the Civil War in 1868, people were used to getting a lot of information from periodicals, but also getting a lot of culture as well. So her readers would be looking at serialized fiction, poetry, as well as politics and news, and they were getting this in a rapidly disseminated manner. This is important with regard to Little Women because it is a novel that was written pretty quickly. In her journals, Alcott mentions that while she was writing the second part of the novel, which came out in 1869, she was trying to write a chapter a day. So that quality of periodicals, which are written quickly and then disseminated quickly, we also see in the novel itself. Of course, another way to think about influences beyond what people read is who did they know? And if you know anything about the Alcott family, you know that Louisa May Alcott knew a lot of pretty important people. Her neighbors in the Concord Circle were some of the great thinkers of America at this time. She lived near Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the Peabody sisters, Margaret Fuller, and Lydia Maria Child, to name just a few of her illustrious neighborhood friends, people she would just see in her regular everyday life. And so I can kind of imagine, because I work with some pretty great people, how being around, that quality of conversation could shape her body of work as well. Of course, more than anything, Alcott's work and Little Women is shaped by the Alcott family. This is a novel that is, I guess we could say, semi-autobiographical. The first half does draw from the Alcott sisters' real experience. The second half, Alcott described as having more to do with her fancy. John Madison has shown the formative influence of Bronson Alcott on his daughter's work and vice versa. And Eve LaPlante and Eiselein Flint have done some excellent work to show the influence of Abigail Alcott, Louisa Alcott's mother, and her sisters, Anna Alcott Pratt, Elizabeth Alcott, and May Alcott Niericker, on Louisa May Alcott's work. So, now we've gotten into, quite a different ways that this novel was influenced by the people in Alcott's life, her intellectual life, as well as her personal life. But I want to turn the conversation in the other direction to think about, so who did Little Women influence? And you can look up the enormous list of celebrities who read and commented on Little Women. Bev Clark has done a nice job tracing her popularity among some 19th and early 20th century celebrities, such as Jane Addams, Helen Keller, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Teddy Roosevelt, and Rudyard Kipling, who all had positive things to say about the novel. There were others who were perhaps a little less enthusiastic, including Edith Wharton and Ida B. Wells, for example. But the point is, the novel was very widely read by women and men, girls and boys. She did so much in Little Women to shape the trajectory of literature in general. There's a famous line by Nina Boehm in which she remarks that, along with Martha Finley's novel Elsie Dinsmore, which came out in the same year or right before Little Women, that Little Women marked the decline of women's fiction as we have studied it, because it represented the transition of women's fiction into children's fiction. I've never known whether I should interpret this statement as one that perhaps minimizes the import of Little Women. I'm not sure that it does, because I think, of course, this becomes the birth of the amazing growth of children's literature that comes after Little Women, and in particular, girls' fiction. And as a little girl who read a lot of books, I can say that all of my childhood favorites that featured cool girl protagonists seem to have a direct link to Little Women. I'm thinking here about Anne of Green Gables, Little House on the Prairie, Nancy Drew, or Harriet the Spy. In each of these texts, I think we see characters that are modeled on characters like Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. Anne Boyd Rue has traced the lineage of some more contemporary works that have been inspired by these strong female characters. And in her list, she includes Hermione Granger from Harry Potter and Rory from Gilmore Girls. But I always see as perhaps the strongest mark of Little Women's influence the stories about circles of women, whether they be sisters or co-workers or friends. That to me is the truest tribute to Little Women. And I'm thinking about, things perhaps as simple as Sex and the City or Dairy Girls, but also some literary examples, The Mothers by Brett Bennett, or Miss Ethel and her circle of women in Toni Morrison's Home, The Resistance in Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. These are groups of women that have deep connections that we see developed in much greater detail than perhaps we had seen before the 19th century in works like Little Women. I know my colleagues on the panel will discuss more about Little Women's staying power, but I thought I would close my remarks today with a line from another one of my heroes, Patti Smith, who wrote in the foreword to the recent Penguin Classics edition, "In Little Women, something extraordinary happened. I recognized myself as if in a mirror." To me, in thinking about the influence of Little Women, both the way it was influenced and the way it would go on to influence other works, this is exactly what Louisa May Alcott did. She saw herself. She was brave enough to see herself in the great authors who came before her. And then she gave a new model to the writers and creators who would come after her. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'd be glad now to turn to Professor Doyle.
Hi, this is, I think I can segue from you, Marlowe, very well, because one of the things that has always been really interesting to me, and I think is a measure of Little Women's greatness, is the way that Alcott in this novel, with plot, with structure, with characterization, and with theme, both honors and interrogates the life of the individual woman, girl, and also honors, interrogates, and values the idea of community. And I'm mostly going to be talking about the individualization, but I think it does both of those things at the same time. And that's one of the things that makes it continually interesting to us. Something to keep in mind as I make my remarks, because it will make a little bit more sense, is that if you didn't already know this, that Little Women, as we read it today, was essentially 2 books before. The first book of Little Women, published in 1868, takes the girls through just 1 year of their life. It begins at Christmas and ends at the next Christmas. And they are 11, 12, and 15, and 16 at the time. So in terms of development, we've only got 1 year of their lives, and they really are children. In the second book, published the next spring, picks up 3 years later to start with, and then takes us 15 years along the journey of the March girls. And so they're in their 30s by the time that ends. So it really comes into fruition as adults in that second book. So it's kind of the individuation works differently in the 2 books, but in both of them, it's what Sandra Zagarel called the narrative of community, but all the individuals need to be contributing to that community. So in book 1, what you have, and Marlowe, you mentioned Dickens, I think you have all of these different, well-drawn characters. When I would teach Little Women as a starting point, sometimes in my classes, just to get the discussion going, I'd have the students write for a few minutes, who's the hero of this novel and why? And while I don't think this book would have been in publication consistently for over 150 years if there hadn't been Jo March. But I got to tell you, everybody gets votes when I ask them who's the hero. Not only all the girls, but Marmee and Hannah, the servant, Mr. Lawrence next door, and they all have something to say. So it seems to me that as readers go into this, you have somebody to identify with. Many, many, many readers see somebody that reflects them, but they're also participating and enjoying the lives of all these people who are not them and who are very, very different. So it shows us a lot of different ways to be, but the success of the community also means that all of those different people contribute into that notion of community. In the whole of Little Women, we see in terms of female vocation, most particularly this detailed look at the progress of a young woman who wants to be a writer in the American 19th century. And as Marlowe mentioned, a lot of those things actually happened to Louisa May Alcott. And it would be any writer, but especially what we see with the women, disdain from editors, people trying to pay them less, being disregarded by critics, some of the specific pragmatic details. But on another level, in a more theoretical level, we also see being played out what Richard Broadhead talked about in Cultures of Letters, this split toward, especially post-war time, between high art and low art, right? And American literature, the guys in charge, sorry, Greg, trying to move away from sentimentality, a more cerebral, intellectual kind of characterization and things like that. And you see in this book, as Jo goes along, these narrative intrusions where it's really clear that Alcott is trying to make some way between sentimentality and realism. She's, actively working on a style that incorporates both of those things. And so it's just such an interesting look at it. For just as an example, there's a point where it's after Beth has died. Sorry if that's a spoiler for any of you. And the narrator jumps in there to look at Jo's response to all this and says, "Now, if Jo had been the heroine of a sentimental moral storybook at this point, here's what she would have done." And it included, getting very ill, dying of sadness and stuff. But Jo wasn't that kind of, she was a real girl. And so here's what she did instead. So you see this navigation between sentimentality and realism getting worked out through it. Jo March, as a writer, tries a whole bunch of different genres of writing in trying to find her style and so on. So you get a really close look at writing as a vocation. But I want to talk a little bit here about the vocation that ultimately all these surviving March girls participate in, and that is marriage. There's been a great deal made of Alcott's resistance to marrying off her characters and so on, and she herself never married. So this was, that's why fancy takes hold in the second book. But we should remember that more than 90% of American women of her day did marry. And Alcott was very big on the fact that, or what, to her, the impulse for what people read, shaping them, having a moral value is what I'm trying to say. And so, I mean, I could see that it behooved her to speak about what that would be like for girls. People, the marriage rates dropped a little bit after the Civil War to about 89%. But in fact, I mean, that was really what, if she's going to take these girls into their 30s, just realism dictates that that you should have some consideration of that. She does talk about single women briefly and positively in both of those books, but the marriages to me are really interesting. I think it's one of the places she draws very strongly from Margaret Fuller, one of her very strong influences, and especially in Fuller's The Great Lawsuit, where she talks about people growing up, women specifically growing up and developing. And as she puts it, union is only possible to those who are units. My favorite line from The Great Lawsuit. So individual growth and development is important if you're going to marry, for Fuller. And then Fuller sets up this hierarchy of what she calls marriages of equality, that get better and better as they go along. And to me, that's exactly what happens in Little Women. Meg's marriage is the most traditional of any of them. That's kind of a, here's your job in this marriage and here's my job, and we both respect each other's jobs. But because Meg, who was, so she was 17 when the first book ends, and she ends up engaged to John Brooke at the end of the first half. And they're gonna be engaged for 3 years. So what? She's 19 or 20 when she gets married, and the fact that she hasn't really grown and developed makes for some complications of their marriage, especially after the twins are born. And she has to do some growing and developing, which she does working with John, and also due to Marmie's good help, so that eventually she gets to a kind of a much more equal and happy marriage. Amy, growing up and developing means going off to Europe to develop her art, to eventually come to terms with, as she says, talent isn't genius, right? And that she's not going to be the next Raphael, as her siblings have referred to her previously. And so what am I going to do with my life? And who is she going to marry but Laurie, who has done kind of the same thing, gone off and tried to work with his music, and realizing that he's not going to be the next Mozart either. And then they are brought together after that. So you could go, well, Ken Pereal wrote a book about Laurie's development and choices and things like that. But their marriage, excuse me, is a marriage of equals in a lot of ways, not financially, but in other ways, but a kind of what Fuller called a more inward-looking kind of marriage. And then when they have a child who is kind of frail, that brings them, close together too. It's I always tell my students that's Fuller's "I only have eyes for you" marriage, right? That's that kind of thing. And Jo's marriage is finally, what I think Fuller would have put at the top of it, which she called a pilgrimage together toward a common shrine, is how she developed, that included the other kinds of marriages, but had something beyond that. And people love to talk about Joe's marriage to Friedrich Baer. I mean, and anybody who talks about Alcott, there has to be a conversation about that. I have to say, I'm on the positive side of that, really. But what I see is Joe, okay, after she has told Laurie she doesn't want to marry him and thinks she never wants to marry anyway, and all of that, she goes off to New York, and grows and develops and becomes so much more of an adult and fully formed kind of human being. And it's so important. I mean, essentially where the March family lived was essentially Concord, little rural. She goes off to New York City, works as a teacher, and we see her growing and developing as the person she is, and that's where she meets Friedrich, and then goes home, right? This is not, mad falling in love. Okay, yeah, let's get married. Actually, Amy and when Amy and Laurie get married, they talk. I think it's Laurie who tells Joe that they were going to come home and get married, but they couldn't wait. So that sort of thing. Joe goes home to tend Beth in her last days and things, and it's later that Friedrich shows up. So when they finally get together, and even then he has to go off for a year and earn some money, they both bring whole completed selves to the table, and then they do a life's work together with the founding of the school where Friedrich was going to be the teacher, and as far as I can tell, Joe kind of runs it, but she's that sort of thing. So there is that independence, but a togetherness too. And go back to the idea of community. Both books of Little Women, as a final point, both books of Little Women begin and end with community. The first book begins and ends with Christmas, and the chapters in between are individual looks at what's going on with each of them. They come together at points, but but she got that Dickens thing about about writing in chapters. The second book essentially begins with Meg's marriage, and it ends with Marmie's 60th birthday, and all the extended family comes together. Each of those individual girls talks about that time when they that's the Castles in the Air chapter, when they were talking about their life's dreams. Each of them individually talks about how their dreams developed and changed over time, and their happiness at that time. And then it sort of all ends with we're happy here together. So the celebration of individuality, as well as the celebration of interdependence, kind of best of both worlds thing, is one of the things that makes Little Women wonderful for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And that now, Professor Eiselein.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone who's here. It's a real pleasure to have been invited to this webinar. And I'm thrilled to be here with Marlowe and Christine. So what I'm going to do is just try to answer the question as directly as possible. And I'm going to limit myself to 7 answers. What makes Little Women the great American novel? I have 7 ideas. One of those ideas is that it's really funny. It's an entertaining comic novel that is hilarious. I think, for instance, of Joe's reaction to finding out that John and Meg are going to get married, or the experiments chapter, not just the cooking, but the girls end up killing a bird, right? And so they have to go outside and have this ridiculous long funeral for the bird. Amy's unique use of the English language in book 1 is hilarious. Her the way she learns to adopt Roman Catholic religious practices, I think, is heartbreaking and hilarious all at the same time. Anyway, I think Little Women is one of the great American comic novels, up there with Huck Finn and Adventures of Augie March. And I think it's one of the ways that Alcott moves beyond that kind of didactic, sentimental pre-Civil War literature without letting go of her ideals or her ethical concerns. I think she's trying to find a way to articulate these ethical concerns in a humorous and playful way. Her kids aren't, Twain makes fun of this really well in his The Bad Little Boy and the Good Little Boy stories. But before Louisa May Alcott, children's literature is dreadful. It is. And good children are rewarded with heaven. Bad children, bears come out of the woods and eat them. I'm not exaggerating. They suffer horrible misfortunes that they've brought on to themselves because of their bad behavior. And Alcott just avoids all of that. And it's not that her characters are not at all perfect, right? But their imperfections are human. And Alcott, I think, kind of gently criticizes, I think of Amy's Valley of Humiliation. The lesson of that chapter might be to avoid egotistical behavior. I think it's how Marmee puts it. You're getting altogether too conceited, I think she says. But Amy's takeaway from this is it's nice to have accomplishments and be elegant, but not to show off too much or get too perked up. And so in some ways, Amy doesn't get it, right? She doesn't get Marmee's lesson, but it doesn't matter. The novel is delightfully not self-righteous. Part of this, Geraldine in the chat mentions Bunyan and Pilgrim's Progress. And the book is modeled in part on Pilgrim's Progress, where the girls have their little red New Testaments as their guidebooks, and they're going to try to be march towards perfection, but they never get there, which reminds me of this other kind of comic theory, is kind of cosmic Christian theory of grace, right? That like in Canterbury Tales, you've got all these totally flawed, hilarious pilgrims, none of whom are perfect in any possible way, but it doesn't matter. Grace kind of covers all of them, and we get a happy ending, even if we don't deserve it. Anyway, comedy is one of them. I think the second one I would mention that Christine mentioned is realism. The Little Women is one of the founding documents of American literary realism, along with Rebecca Harding Davis, Life in the Iron Mills, Twain's earliest writings. I mean, this is the beginning of realism as a literary movement. The characters' dialogue is not purged of the slang. It includes all the colloquialisms and the grammatical errors. The March girls' struggles are familiar. Meg wants to be noticed and liked and accepted by other girls in the community. Beth craves music lessons and a nice piano. Amy worries about her appearance all the time. And they work to overcome these imperfectly. But these aren't the adventures of some of the characters in, Alcott's thrillers. Where you have sensational exploits or most of the pre-Civil War literature. It's realism. It's the third thing I would mention is it's an amazing family story, and a lot of people think that the conventional, and it's amazing because, in my opinion, it's pro-mom. And a lot of people think that literature is filled with idealizations of mothers, and I would say, I don't think so. I look at literary history and I think of absent, weak, dangerous, untrustworthy, and bad mothers, Medea or Gertrude in Hamlet, or Cinderella's stepmom, or on and on. They're often foils for the development of characters. But in the 19th century, I think of Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Or Marie St. Clair and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Anyway, Marmee is not a bad mom. She's an awesome mom. She's kind, she's strong, she's intelligent. She lets the girls figure it out for themselves, but she's also there to be supportive. I think that's important. Number 4 is emotion. The novel has an incredible emotional range. It's impressive, it's moving. Alcott will take you from tears to laughter quickly. The same as Dickens. I mean, I think she was inspired by Dickens. But, you know, we have the joy of Mr. March's return from the Civil War. Some people always cry when Beth dies. I always cry when Mr. March comes back. There's Jo's moment under the umbrella with Professor Bear when she realizes she found her soulmate. I'm with Christine. I'm positive about this wedding. Beth's death is famously moving and sad, and Alcott goes right to what makes it super sad. But I also think there's Jo's anger, there's Jo's loneliness, there's Marmie's anger, there's Meg's frustration with married life. I mean, she finally gets what she wants. Book 2, well, I'll say that in a minute, but she gets married and find out, ooh, marriage is tough. Or Meg's desire to be liked. That's number 5. I'm not going to go on too much about this, but Little Women is an artistic aesthetic achievement that I think is vastly underappreciated. Some of it is the way that Marlowe's kind of alluded to, her incorporation of Goethe and German idealism that is, Christine has written about this, but not a lot of other people have. You mentioned how quickly it was written. I think she's trying to capture, the realism here is trying to capture vivid moments and flashes of life rather than the whole story. But and the combination of realism and sentimentalism. But for me, one of the great achievements of this book is the way that Alcott links or yokes together contraries. One of her characteristic artistic moves is to take light and dark, or happy and sad, or things that are opposites, and pull them together and make them exist together at the very same moment. The sad funeral for the bird, which is also hilarious, for instance. Or I think a lot about how Jo in part 2 loses her artistic or authorial voice when she's trying to become a writer. And she only regains it in the trilogy when she kind of like, I'm going to focus on other things. And that's when her kind of artistic voice comes back. Book 2, as Christine mentioned, starts with marriage. Novels don't start with marriage. Novels end with marriage. But, you know, Alcott kind of flip-flops things. She does interesting things with gender reversals and juxtaposes chapters, or she puts Gothic elements right next to family story. 2 more things. Number 6. An essay that I love is David Hume's Of the Standards of Taste from 1757. And it might be tongue-in-cheek, but he says, I'm going to make an objective case for what makes literature great. And his objective case really has to do not with a kind of fine-grained a reading of the aesthetic elements that make it great, but instead I think, this is my reading of it, is that great literature is that which just lasts, that it stands the test of time, to put it into a cliche. I think Hume is a model for you can make an empirical case for canonical status or great American novel. It's the novels that live on. In our century, you know, Alcott in this book in particular has been lavished with all the kind of scholarship and accoutrements, the editions that say this is a canonical great piece of literature, the Library of America series, or I think of the prestigious annotated editions from Harvard and Norton that came out. She's the subject of PBS documentaries. There's a substantial body of criticism about her work. She's been a huge influence on a lot of writers and a lot of popular culture sense. And she's a great writer. And the last thing I'm going to mention that makes it great is readers continue to want to engage with this book over and over and over again. Marlowe alluded to like the number of famous people that love this book, writers, great leaders. You mentioned Teddy Roosevelt Marlowe. He said that he worshiped this book. Sandra Day O'Connor, this was her favorite book. Laura Bush thought, First Lady Laura Bush thought of this as one of the 5 great pieces of American literature, a whole list of writers. And I'm not going to repeat it unless anybody wants. But then now too, all these spin-offs and adaptations. Before you started, we were talking with David about all the movie versions. But the movie versions are just the tip of the iceberg if you start to think about its influence, including somebody mentioned Sex and the City. I think of that in this book, Alcott lays down this kind of story about 4 very different women with different personalities who play off each other and creates the drama of the text. And whether it's the Golden Girls or the HBO series Girls or Sex and the City and a whole bunch of others, Alcott laid down this plot formula for a lot of successive people. But I also think about the people that say, what are the great books? So the PBS Great American Reads, where Little Women is in the top 10, up there with To Kill a Mockingbird. The Atlantic a few years back had an article about where people ranked literature, and Little Women came in 12th there. The other entries on the list, the only other entries on this list published before 1900 were the Holy Bible, Jane Austen, and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and so much more. Anyway, what I want to say here with the 7th one is there's something about Little Women that invites rereading, that invites people to come back to it and relive it. I think that's why we love our adaptations. We want to relive the novel in a way. And for me, this text that invites reading and reading again is one of the hallmarks of the great book. So those are my 7 answers to why this is a great novel.
Thank you all so much. That's wonderful. So let's see. I'm going to quickly see if there are wonderful questions to do. And I think, frankly, it's more comments. I'm going to ask for people, please put questions in. So I am going to ask, I suppose, actually, then you mentioned children's literature. How much? So there's a theory that a great deal of the modern children's literature is actually born in Britain. One, is that theory false? And 2, to the extent it's true, how much is the classic children's literature of Great Britain feeding off of Alcott? For anybody.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. People say that Great Britain does fantasy best in children's literature, and that America does realism best in children's literature. So I mean, Little Women was and is very popular over there as well. But I think, the whole sort of domestic realism and realism generally seems more American than that. Little Women in terms of around the world, of course, it's been everywhere. I always think it's so interesting how popular it is in Japan. Actually, which doesn't answer your question, but I think that, the family orientation, it fits in the culture very well, that, the popularity, and even we were talking before, the anime versions of it now, that's another place that it has influenced and been very important.
I think that's a great answer, Christine. I would just add too that it's an interesting, the question is interesting in part because you're reminded that in a way, Canada and Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables and the US, what's going on in the US and what's going on in Great Britain, they're not separated, right? Everybody's reading everybody else's novels. And Alcott is so influenced, not so much, I think, by the children's writers, but by the, though she came to admire some, but, you know, the writers that Marlowe mentioned, including especially Dickens.
And Professor Daly-Galeano, you want to add to that, or?
Well, I was thinking about Greg's comment of how, you know, widely people were reading in this period. And Alcott, of course, has some very funny stories, as does May Alcott Nieriker, about people in Europe reading her books and the kind of celebrity that they encountered in going over to Europe and being recognized as part of the Alcott family. So certainly, you know, her work was, I mean, there was a question in the chat, I think, about critical response, and this is more popular response, but it was widely appreciated. And of course, the popularity is going to shape literary output as, you know, and economic features as much as aesthetic qualities. So.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question from Diane Duray and expand it a little. She asks, was Louisa May Alcott influenced by Jane Austen, who was not on your list of famous authors, I believe you said? And I guess I want to expand that to, well, what we now regard as the canonical list of female writers of the 19th century. Well, you know, beyond Fanny Burney, who's 18th century, but, you know, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Is she reading them? Is she influenced by them? And is there any consciousness on her part of using them as models precisely as female authors or female subject matters? Or, you know, is that not the way she would think about it at all?
Well, Chris, I think you should start with this.
She thought about it plenty, right? Plenty. Lots of. I can't. I had looked up how many other books are referred to in Little Women, and I think that from Bev's book, and I can't remember what the number was, but certainly, I mean, Charlotte Bronte is all over her work, right? You don't see it quite so much in Little Women, but it, you know what? We came along at such a wonderful time when all the thrillers were being discovered, and that led to some of her other adult novels being reprinted. And so you look at her whole her whole canon of work, that she quotes and rehashes Charlotte Bronte a lot. But she, as you mentioned, Jane Austen, which I don't think she ever really talks about, but there's a place in Joe's Boys where the girls are talking about writers they love, and one of the characters says she specifically does not like George Eliot because she's too cold, basically, and unemotional. But and the character says, "But give me Charlotte Bronte." That's she likes the power and the emotion and all of that sort of thing. So I think as people point out, she just read so much, but she was attracted to the more Dickens, much more emotional content and stuff, rather than the super intellectual kind of thing.
I want to just jump in here because Claudia Nelson is in the audience. Hi, Claudia. But she mentioned Charlotte Young, and I think about the heir of Radcliffe, which is alluded to in and the family story in general, but Christine's right. I mean, Charlotte Bronte's influence seems to just be overwhelming compared to a lot of the others, but Charlotte Young, Mariah Edgeworth, I think, is an important one to mention. And I would just add one more that I don't think was an influence, but that Alcott noticed, which was George Eliot. And Alcott read George Eliot very carefully. And I think she was almost awed by like, whoa, what's going on here is amazing and heavy and intellectual. But I don't think she felt it as an influence. And I'd be interested what Christine and Marlowe think, but I think she's a little intimidated by Eliot.
I'd agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I was just going to, when you were talking about Alcott's humor and another female writer, I was just thinking about Eden Southworth, and she's got a nice little dig at Eden Southworth in Little Women. So while this is probably not a case where she was trying to emulate that style of writing in many ways, I think we can see conversation with a popular piece of writing written by another very successful female author.
You mentioned Goethe as somebody she read an awful lot. How much is she, to expand this a little bit, how much is she consciously influenced by the Bildungsroman tradition?
I think Little Women is a Bildungsroman.
Yeah.
And actually, Marlowe mentioned some writing I did on that. And Ralph Waldo Emerson gave her the apprenticeship of Wilhelm Meister when she was 16. And she writes in her journal that from that time on, Goethe was her hero. She has, the books that she owned that are at Orchard House and in Concord, many of his works, but Wilhelm Meister really importantly. And when I went and read through, she wrote two takeoffs on Faust, actually, that were kind of interesting. Guy sells his soul to be a great writer, that sort of thing. But Wilhelm Meister sets out. I didn't know this because I kind of knew about it, but hadn't really read it. But then when I read it, starts out with Wilhelm and some of his friends, and there's a puppet show for Christmas that his parents organize. And I just said, oh, the Christmas theatricals, right? And many of the things that happen in Meister come up in very interesting ways in the March trilogy generally. To me, Little Women, even though it refers to things all over the place, is probably the most I want to say original, but it's more than that. Because at some points, like she has in some of her thrillers, she's directly quoting from Jane Eyre and revising it and stuff. And Little Women doesn't do that much, but I really, I do think because she knew Meister from the time she was a 16-year-old, that's it, especially in terms of Joe's story, it really is that, that's the model.
And of course, her 1873 novel work is a classic Bildungsroman, following a single protagonist throughout her working adult life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a question, if I might follow up. Expanding on Joseph Levin, he asks, why did Ida B. Wells and Edith Wharton dislike or negatively critique Little Women? And I guess I want to expand that. Who else who is notable has disliked her, critiqued her? And I would like to ask you, what is the strongest negative critique of her? I mean, look, I'm assuming you all love her. What's the strongest critique?
Can I want to hear Marlowe, but I'm going to jump in here real quick and mention that a kind of weaker critique. And I think of Henry James, and he criticized everybody, but he objected to the slang, which I think a lot of us now, and a lot of fans of realism, they appreciate the kind of attempt to capture language in action. I think Ida, Marlowe might know more than me, but I think Ida B. Wells both liked and disliked, or I think it was mixed.
Yeah.
Edith Wharton, well, I'll let somebody else.
Oh, no, keep going. I was just acknowledging it was mixed.
Wharton came from a different class of writers. I mean, she hung with the wealthy, and I think Wharton both acknowledged the greatness of Alcott and thought that there was something low about it and not dignified.
Yeah, there's when you were talking about Henry James, there's a story that Julian Hawthorne told about at this party that was a celebration of the success of Little Women, that according to Julian Hawthorne, Henry James, who was 10 years younger maybe, and was just like starting out and getting his as a critic and everything, and he leaned across the table and said to Louisa, "When people tell you you're great, you mustn't pay attention because it isn't true." So that was Henry James. Let's see, Ernest Hemingway scorned Little Women. It's not clear he ever read it, but he knew it was bad. And as one of the people in the chat commented, James Baldwin, put it with Uncle Tom's Cabin as a really bad book about its sentimentality. I mean, these were people who liked the clear cut, whatever they termed intellectual approach, and didn't like anything emotional, I think, that was expressed emotionally.
I just want to jump in on the Baldwin thing, because I think like Hemingway, it maybe reveals that, I don't know, maybe he didn't study Little Women, because Little Women is such a different book from Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah.
I don't know. Little Women doesn't feel sentimental to me. I mean, there's emotion, there's sadness, but I don't think we should call every sad book sentimental. I think the sentimental means something specific. For Baldwin, it's so sentimental that for Baldwin, he hates sentimentalism because he doesn't think the emotions are true. And for sentimentalists, from Adam Smith, Theory of Moral Sentiments, through that English philosophical tradition into the women writers of the 19th century, that is the thing that they hate the most, right? Is false emotion. And so there's a way in which I think that Baldwin is on the same page as the sentimentalists. Like, false emotion is a bad thing, but.
Well, and to build off that, I think absolutely what Baldwin is critiquing is sentimental literature. And I think some of the critiques about the novel being using sloppy language are actually critiques of realism as well. And so if you have readers who are not necessarily interested in engaging with a work that draws from those schools, then of course they're not going to find pleasure in the style and the content itself.
There was a question about literary reception I want to follow up. And what was literary reception? And I guess I would actually ask, for the first, shall we say, 20 years or so, which is presumably enough time to get it established, what was the literary reception from publication for the next 20 years?
Explosion.
I could find that quotation for you, but it was the quotation is something. It was all the rage in '69. It was a bestseller. It was hugely popular. And it was kind of loved from top to bottom. Like the literary critics, it was reviewed very favorably. But lots of writers loved it. It was widely read. Kids loved it. I mean, it was a kind of big deal, and very positively. I think in the 1920s, you start to see both high literary culture, not just the Wharton and the James from earlier decades, but maybe high literary culture in general start to wonder, like, is this a good book? Is this something that we should actually teach in our great literature classes? And a number of people, including Broadhead and Bev Clark, who Christine mentioned, have written about this. Yeah, I have more to say, but.
Does anybody else want to jump in before he has more to say?
Well, I could just share. It's a fairly well-known story about the publication of the book, which is that Alcott wasn't sure about it. As she was writing Little Women, she didn't think it was very interesting or very good. And when she sent the first 12 chapters to her publisher, Thomas Niles, he shared it with some young readers who thought it was incredible. And as a result, he gave that feedback to her and she finished the first volume. And I think when the first volume gained that kind of just astonishing praise at a level she never would have imagined, that really fueled Alcott's work in finishing the second part of the novel, which she did so quickly. And there was great demand for.
Yeah, there was huge demand. Alcott went from their family was famously poor. This is one of the ways she romanticizes the March family in Little Women is that they're less poor than the Alcotts actually were. I mean, they never had a servant or anything like that. But anyway, she went from this. She was determined to write to help her family, the finances, and went from owing money to, because she puts in her ledger at the ends of her journals, like the money she got and what she did. By a year from then, she'd paid off all the bills and was investing, made her family comfortable, paid off all the bills and was actually had money to invest. That's how much it was selling. And as Greg pointed out, the reviews were positive too. It became a cultural phenomenon, as time went on too.
And Christine and Marlowe, just to add to that, to the story, Marlowe mentioned the editor Thomas Niles. Like, he's the one that proposed to her. He said, "Hey, do you want to try your hand at a girl's novel?" And she said initially she was reluctant, and then she said she would try. But after the reaction of the young readers in manuscript form, the 12 chapters, when she delivered the first volume, Niles came to her and said, "Hey, do you want us just to pay you for this, or do you want to have royalties?" And she was hard up for money at the time, as Christine mentioned, and she said, "I don't know. What do you think?" And Niles said, "You should keep the royalties," which, like, she made a fortune off the book, which she would not have made had she, just written it for the one big paycheck. Why do I mention that being important? Well, as much as I love the adaptations, including the Greta Gerwig, the composite figure Niles is sometimes portrayed as kind of a mean, exploitative editor, and he wasn't. He's probably responsible for the publication of Little Women and the fortune that she made from it. So he was a good guy, not a bad guy.
Yeah. And I just add another anecdote to that. She was so smart about her money. She never married, but she adopted her sister Anna's son so that he would inherit, all the royalties and the rights and everything, and pass that down, to the point that when I think it was in 1995, when Long Fatal Love Chase came out, which was a recovered a manuscript of a thriller, full novel-length thriller that she had never published, it was recovered and got published. So Louisa May Alcott was briefly on the bestseller list again. But three of that nephew's descendants got money from that. So she took care of her family for 100 years after she died by being smart about that. But you're right, Greg, and that's I like a lot of things about the Greta Gerwig one, but I think Thomas Niles gets he really was a good guy, and she acknowledged what a really generous and smart advice that was for her.
Nifty. I'm going to go to a question from Franz Zeitz, if I may. In what kind of courses should we best teach Little Women, if we should teach it? And I want to add to that, in what kinds of courses have you taught Little Women, and how does it teach?
Teach is great.
And that's a great question, yeah. Where should we start? We all have experience, so.
Professor Daly-Galeano, you're first in the alphabet. You get to go first.
Sure. Well, I've taught Little Women in a variety of courses, and I've done it in 19th century American lit alongside Moby Dick and novels of the 19th century, and it works nicely there. But I also most recently have been teaching it in literary analysis courses as perhaps the single novel that I do teach in a selection where we're also looking at poetry and short fiction and nonfiction and drama as well. And in fact, one project I did with my students in that class, because they were many of them fairly new to Alcott's work and, in fairly introductory level course at our institution, a 200 level class, we put together some readers guides. The students made readers guides to give to our local libraries. And so they had to figure out, okay, how will readers in the community who are not necessarily scholarly readers engage with this text? And that was a very fun project to do with students. And I was so surprised because as an Alcott scholar, I have people come up to me all the time telling me, oh, I've read Little Women as a child. I've read it 25 times. I love it. But my students in that class, not a single one of them had ever read it before. And so I think that is, the reality of teaching this work right now, where you might, in an earlier generation, find several students who had read it as children. That wasn't the case in my most recent teaching of the novel.
Professor Doyle?
I've taught it in a lot of contexts. My teaching job was children's literature and 19th century American lit, so I did some of each. I think it, for some of the reasons, what the context of what Marlowe was just saying, I think it taught less well in my children's lit classes. My children's lit was the students who were preparing to be elementary teachers. They wanted contemporary stuff, and they weren't very willing to engage with something of that length and things, but they usually kind of came around. But one fun thing, I taught a class where I paired, called it He Said, She Said, and paired similar things by a man and a male and female writer in the 19th century. So we did Frederick Douglass with Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and paired Little Women with Tom Sawyer. And that was really effective. Here's the girl's story, here's the boy's story, here's how in the boy's story Twain talks about girls, and here's how boys appear in Little Women. And that was a really interesting kind of thing to do too.
So my favorite way for undergraduates, first year students, I teach a course called Great Books that starts with biblical and classical literatures and kind of goes to the present. And we don't hit everything, of course, like there's no time, but I always like to do a big 19th century novel in that course. And I don't always teach Little Women, but I do sometimes, and it teaches really well in that context. And that's a blast. For graduate students, my favorite thing to do is the major author course. Sometimes I'll do Alcott and Twain together, which is really fun for reasons that Christine mentioned or alluded to. But also I co-taught a major author course focused just on Alcott with my colleague, Dr. Ann Phillips. And that was really great because you get a chance to read the whole body of work with a group of students. And so great books and major authors, that's where I teach Alcott.
50. Okay, let's see. So I just try to see if there's another. I'm wondering if you should, I see a comment, Hemingway was the worst. Maybe everyone can just agree with that one. Well, actually, it's a question from Maria Morales Jaramillo. Do you think that Little Women would be considered as a feminist novel? And I will then push as usual. And what sort of a feminist novel? Let's presume there's more than one type in this big world of ours.
I think you have to consider it a feminist novel. For one, like she was from a reformist family, right? They're anti-slavery, they're temperance, and they're women's rights. And in the 19th century, the women's right to vote was the kind of the core issue of the women's, not the only issue by any means, but a core issue. And Louisa was so proud to have been the first woman to vote in Concord. And so Alcott herself is clearly a feminist or a 19th century women's rights activist. But I think the other part that strikes a lot of us as very feminist is that she doesn't imagine that being a woman is one thing, that it's not a stereotype that you have to live up to, and that she tries real hard to show that these 4 different girls are very, very different and want different things, and they're all okay, right? Meg wants to get married. The book approves of that, right? Jo wants to become a writer and live on her own and be an intellectual and be independent. The book approves of that, right? And so, yeah, I say yes.
Professor Doyle?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like the context of she's a 19th century feminist, and a lot of things get questioned from a 21st century view, but she certainly would, look at how Marmee runs that household, and and that is approved of as you say as well. I think you see it more overtly in some of the other things that she's written in addition to Little Women. Again, all of us have read a lot of her different work, and I'm just thinking actually of Jo's Boys. There's a lot of discussion. There's one of the girls at Plumfield who's going to be a doctor, and there's one of my favorite parts of this is that some of the boys who have been at Plumfield go off to Harvard, and they come back and they're trying to treat the girls, go get me some lemonade and stuff, and they have a big fight about Harvard, which was famously not admitting girls. I mean, it took them another 100 years actually, but when in an era, so that came out in 87, right? That colleges were beginning to become co-ed and stuff, and Harvard was pretty famous for resisting that. So she gets into a lot more of the specifics of it in some of the other things, but it's absolutely a feminist kind of take where you have some choices and you have to live with the choices you make, but you do have choices.
And my
And the
screen has
third-
frozen. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I can hear you all. I just can't see you anymore. But I just wanted to build on what you had talked about earlier, Chris, with regards to marriages. And I think the way that Alcott depicts marriages in Little Women is very feminist. First, we see Jo really, making a choice and saying no to Laurie when he asks her, and she really thinks about what she needs and what she wants. But I also love to point out what I call the sex scene in Little Women. I think that in her own 19th century, fairly cautious way, Alcott was also giving us a novel that is sex positive, right? The scene where Meg gets into the argument with John, and afterwards they make up about the coat. And, it's pretty clear from the language that this is going to end up in the bedroom in a just delightful, positive way. So to me, I think Alcott does sends a lot of messages to women of the 19th century and much later of ways that they can be fulfilled within the vocation of marriage, not necessarily a traditional or restrictive marriage.
Thank you. Let me see. Question from Wesley Brown. What did Samuel Clemens think of Alcott, Little Women, and her other work?
That's a good, I wish if Roberta Treitz is here, she should tell us. I don't think we know. There's a story that helped me with a quote if I get it wrong, but that Alcott was critical of Twain for for corrupting our pure-minded laddies and lassies, or something like that. I can't remember the quote, but where she criticizes Twain. He got this criticism a lot for being immoral, right? Because like kids smoke and they don't listen to their teachers and all that kind of stuff. But Beverly and Clark, in her book on the reception of Little Women, I think points out really clearly that this has got to be an apocryphal story, because it doesn't sound like Alcott at all. That she sounds very kind of moralistic and as if she doesn't get the joke in Twain, and she would have gotten the joke. And the rest of the story is that Twain was delighted to hear this because it would sell more copies if a famous author like Alcott was criticizing the book for its morals. But I don't think it's a true story. And it doesn't sound like Alcott at all. And there's very little that we have about what Twain thought about Alcott or Alcott thought about Twain. That's my take. Yeah, Mae Muffet. Well, and what's her name? Amy March in Tom Sawyer.
Becky.
What?
Becky
Thatcher.
No, Amy, I'm sorry, not Amy March, Amy Lawrence. Before Tom falls for Becky Thatcher, his girlfriend is Amy Lawrence. And some people think that also might be a little dig at Louisa. And I wouldn't be surprised if they felt a rivalry, but I don't believe that she was upset with Twain's morals. But
I'm going to go back to a question from Amy Lindsay. Was Little Women written as a children's book, and is it considered now? And I guess this, was there a genre of children's books then? Does she invent it? So how much for adults? How much for children? What is the audience it sells to, or is considered to be selling to?
But she took the original contract as, I want you to write a girl's book. And, and they are, as I said, 11 and 12 and 15 and 16 in the first one. I would just say that after that, it was an everybody book. Although, as everybody has kind of pointed out in one way or another, Alcott really did feel like this moral obligation to be moral and to, she acknowledged a child audience too in the children's books. It's just that they were so good that everybody else read them too. But I think, she wrote 8 novels that are considered children's novels. Besides her, she wrote adult novels, and she did the other thriller fiction as well.
A number of, I'm thinking of Anne Phillips, and remind me if I'm missing somebody else that's important. But one of the pleasures of rereading Little Women is that you can reread it at different ages, and you see different things and have different experiences and emotions. And when I was younger, it was Jo and her anger and her rage at Amy for burning her book, because I would have been really upset about that. And then that's not the thing I'm most focused on now, but and so I think and children's lit theorists have talked about this. There's a way in which books for young people are often have at least 2 audiences, grown-ups and you see this in Disney movies, and that there's one narrative, there's one level set of jokes that are for the grown-ups, and there's something else going on for kids. And it's one of the things that makes, I think, a book a classic, is that ability to talk to multiple audiences at the same time.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you. It's 3:26, so what I'm going to do is ask could each of you give perhaps a 1-minute closing statement, anything you had left to say, any closing words, period, and I will even reverse the order alphabetically. Professor Eiselein, could I ask you to go first?
Yeah, oh gosh. So 1-minute closing statement. It's a great book. And I'm not going to say it is the great book, because I think there are a lot of them. But I also believe that our time on this planet is short, and one should spend their time reading some really great stuff rather than just anything. And I think this ought to be on everybody's list of an important book to read.
Thank you. Professor Doyle?
I'd like to just, first of all, thank you for putting this together. This has been fabulous fun for me. This isn't anything different than what we've said already, but I just would say there's such a richness to Little Women that it bears going back to again and again. For you see in the 4 major feature films of it, how differently in different times people took different takes on it. There's just so much in it to look at in so many different ways. And I know from my own experience, when the first time I went back to it as an adult, when I got to the chapter on the shelf where Meg is all upset and feeling like her life is over because here she is with these kids and all of that stuff, I didn't think that was in Little Women. Where did this chapter come from? I don't remember this. And I still have my book that I got when I was 10 years old. I thought, gee, maybe that was abridged or something. I went, no, it was there, but that's not what I read, as a 10-year-old. And so much of it is rich to me in different ways. And I think, as Greg said before, that's the sign of a really great book.
Thank you. Professor Daly-Galeano.
Yes, well, I'd also just like to echo what the other panelists have said, and thank you for putting this together. I do think, that perhaps Little Women is not always as appreciated as I believe it deserves to be in critical and academic circles. And for a while, I was feeling kind of sad that maybe younger readers don't seem to be reading it as much anymore. But in thinking about the work we've done here today and some of the things Chris and Greg have already said, the plethora of adaptations and the different forms in which readers are able to engage with this text is truly a testament to its staying power and the way that it continues to be relevant and has been relevant over the last 150 years.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to say thank you so much to all of you. And the all of you is going to be 1 to our speakers and 2 to our audience. Couldn't have done it without you. It's for you. We depended on your questions and they were a lovely set of questions. So wonderful. Thank you. And I will just advertise, we will be having further webinars. We're having, the end of our American history webinars are coming up. We are having more great American literature webinars coming up. Golly, what is the next one? It's impossible for me to tell. Well, I know we have my Aunt Naya down a while, but I think there's something a bit before then. But anyway, we are going to be going on to, among other things, Willa Cather. We have, in addition to the great American literature, our history, we may even have an American inventors webinar series coming up. Stay tuned for that. I will just repeat once more, you can send questions to me, randall@nas.org. Anything that didn't get answered, I will be glad to forward to the participants so they can have the option of answering you. And this will be up, as I say, on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. You will be able to see this. If you're a participant, you'll be able to send it to friends, family, enemies, I don't know. Anyway, thank you all so much. It's been wonderful, entertaining, illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you.